Welcome everyone to the Canberra Playhouse. My name is Virginia Rigney. I'm the Senior Curator at Canberra Museum and Gallery, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, to the artists, to the emerging elders of the Ngunnawal people on whose land that we are sitting and enjoying I think what's going to be a really interesting presentation today. I'd like to acknowledge the insights, knowledge and power that they give to our understanding of this country, and for all the associations and collaborations that we are currently doing and hope to do at Canberra Museum and Gallery. Before we enter into the symposium proper, so you're here today at the Contour 556 Symposium. But the first speaker is actually a word from our sponsor, and it's a pretty important one. Malcolm Snow, who's the CEO of the City Renewal Authority, is just going to give us, a brief insight from the City Renewal Authority's point of view about some of the conversations that we're having today. Of course, City Renewal Authority have actually supported this event and a number of others for Contour 556, which is enabling them to present a range of different works in the heart of the city here in Civic. So welcome, Malcolm.
Thanks, Virginia, for that introduction. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we are gathered and offer my respects to their elders and to any other First Nations people who are with us here today. I acknowledge the ongoing contribution they make to the life and cultural vitality of our city and the surrounding region. Urban renewal is both a process and an outcome with interwoven physical, economic, social and cultural threads. As such, it cannot occur without a city government actively engaging its community and change makers in that journey. In pursuing a transformative agenda, cities need a compelling story to motivate and drive collaboration. The arts in its various forms helps communicate these messages and stories, in turn catalysing the critical connections and community cohesiveness needed across diverse platforms. Imaginative and innovative projects support successful renewal in a holistic sense, acknowledging that at its core, city revitalisation is a cultural project. Its leaders and change makers can tailor the enabling action through physical improvements and economic stimuli. A more holistic approach, however, is predicated on the need to foster a collective shift in the mindset of residents, workers and visitors to consider diverse perspectives and meanings for place. In this way, a city's renewal becomes intrinsically connected to the continued development of its cultural and civic identity, informed in part by a thriving and diverse local arts ecology. In Canberra, the authority is leading the revitalisation of the City Renewal Precinct, and as a design-led agency, we advocate for and seek to create and curate contemporary and lively public spaces across the precinct, with the aim that this nurtures creativity and diverse possibilities for anyone visiting, living or connected to the precinct. In 2018, we commissioned cultural consultants Form to work with us on an urban art strategy to inform the implementation of our renewal program. Completed last year after extensive community engagement, the strategy gives us clear direction on the integration of urban art across the precinct's public spaces. The strategy calls for artworks located within the public realm to deploy the full spectrum of the arts, encompassing the visual and performing arts, literature, as well as the applied arts of architecture and design. We want more ambitious, indeed provocative, urban art making, using the key enablers of cultural participation and civic engagement to support the reimagining and remaking of our different precinct places. This in turn contributes to economic vitality, and in the post-pandemic world, social and economic recovery are, of course, and must be our immediate priority. The recommendations in the strategy are aligned with the authority's strategic plan to 2025. It complements a suite of documents developed by us and others to direct the broader urban design and cultural imperatives for our precinct. It's also why one of our most important and game-changing renewal initiatives is the Canberra Civic Arts and Cultural Precinct, the centrepiece of which will be a new Canberra theatre complex surrounded by reinvigorated public spaces, creative industries, and critically, revenue-generating commercial and retail uses. As a place of civic and cultural importance at the epicentre of Canberra and an apex of the National Triangle, this transformation befits an iconic location and takes civic participation and the cultural economy as its centrepieces. The unabashed ambition is to create the beating cosmopolitan heart of our nation's capital through the design, development and programming of a dynamic 24/7 cultural district that is globally recognised. The urban art strategy sets the guiding principles and benchmarks that underpin the conception, integration and commissioning of urban art across the precinct over the next 5 years. It outlines the parameters within which these opportunities will be pursued and establishes themes that ensure the outcomes are authentic to the precinct, aligned to what both the community and government have told us they aspire to for the city precinct and for Canberra as a creative city. I just want to share a small selection of recent commissions by the authority that have already been informed by the strategy, and they include the artworks for the annual Enlighten in the City projections on the Sydney and Melbourne buildings by local artists Hannah Quinlivan, Jodie Cunningham and George Rose. The Peak Stuff installation by Goldberg Aberline, also for the Enlighten in the City. The Crying Dinghy sculpture at Henry Rowland Park by Canberra artist Hannah Hoyne. The Lunchbox acoustic series in Braddon and Civic with performances by local and interstate musicians. And finally, the Cygnus Atratus photographic exhibition on the Melbourne building by Genevieve Swift, a City Grant recipient. Since taking on the management of the City Centre Marketing and Improvement Levy in early 2018, the authority has distributed nearly $900,000, nearly $1 million in grant funding for either cultural or arts projects. Contour 556 was a recipient in 2018 and again this year, and we're delighted how that investment has supported its continued success under the stewardship of the very persuasive Mr. Hobbs. Our goal is to ensure that future urban and art initiatives are spearheaded not just by the authority, but in partnership with other ACT government agencies, but also with the private sector, local arts organisations and other cultural entrepreneurs. The authority recognises the importance of Arts ACT as the government's arts agency, providing policy and funding advice to government, and I want to acknowledge the fantastic leadership of Sam Tyler and her team. Arts ACT also manages the ACT Government's public art collection of over 100 works, a significant number of which fall within our precinct. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you briefly about the art of renewal. I'd like to congratulate Neil for his vision, cultural leadership and tenacity. We need a city full of Neils, because without them, Canberra is the poorer. I'd like to conclude by sharing an observation by Charles Landry, the internationally recognised cultural strategist who we brought to Canberra in late 2019 for a series of critical public conversations. In his report to us, he says, Canberra should aim to project itself as a can-do place that exudes style, verve and imagination. Avoiding hype is key. There is a fine balance between letting the ambition pull the reality and the realities exemplifying the ambition. This notion flips Canberra's ideal to reflect a city of conviviality and of potential chance encounter. It's an ambition that emphasises softer infrastructures, such as creating atmospheres which require a strong urban design input, as well as a wide-ranging opportunities to connect people and organisations across the city and the wider world through vigorous cultural programming. For the authority, this is an ambition which we regard as being perfectly aligned to our renewal goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malcolm, and I might get our two speakers who are in the audience to come and sit on the panel. So welcome to the start of the symposium and discussion proper. Sadly, one of our speakers, Elspeth Pitt, has been just very last minute unable to join us, so I've been able to include some of the material that she was going to cover in my conversation. So Canberra is known as a place with a suite of formal public sculptures and monuments, most the result of quite a lengthy commissioning process, with the artists required to fill demanding briefs for longevity and public safety. As sites respectful for national commemoration and in some cases pilgrimage, for locals they can sometimes then become the backdrop for your regular commute, your walk or your cycle. And in the process, some start to become unseen. Others almost shyly blend into the landscape of the Griffin's grand vision. We've got a recent significant addition in this suite, and that is Daniel Boyd's collaboration with Edition Office for Our Country at the Australian War Memorial. But our city has a lesser known history of being the stage for the presentation of challenging temporal sculpture, performance and multimedia practices. These are the occasions for artistic experimentation, for risk-taking, and for not a little controversy. Critical to many is the idea that seeing art in the public domain is being more of a witness, not just a witness, but to be an active participant in the interaction with the artist's ideas. And at their best, they have offered and can offer the kinds of unscripted moments of encounter that has literally changed lives. And from our speakers later on, I think you'll hear a little of that. So our conversation this afternoon in session one is to shed light on some of the key moments in Canberra's history of these of the kinds of fleeting art that we're seeing this year in Contour 556. But with much of this work, past work, ephemeral and very loosely documented, this is an opportunity to refresh our appreciation of the ambitions and impacts of some of these works, and in so doing recover some of those lost creative moments that are kind of laid down like an invisible archaeology in our memory. For me, as a curator working here at CMAG, I enjoy dipping into our incredible G drive of archive of and filing system of images. And I came across this photograph about a year ago when I was preparing a talk for Design Canberra last year on the design origins and ambitions of Civic Square and the public artwork that was in that square. And I looked at this and, it read to me as a pink lava lamp in the middle of Civic Square. I could see from both the buildings behind and the cars that it would have placed it in the mid-70s. And I was here at high school then. I very likely went past it, but I had no memory of it. There was an intriguing tag on the photograph that said, just said, Tower, music by Tangerine Dream. So, yeah, okay, what was that? So it's been in conversation and it's kind of almost taken a year, but we know, and I didn't want to sort of prelude this conversation too much for our speaker who's coming next, but its title is Chromosonic Tower by leading experimental multimedia artist Stan Kurkovsky, and it was and it was commissioned for Australia 75 in March of that year. And Stephen Jones, who's speaking second, will draw from his extensive archive and engagement with that work and that milieu of stands to give us the background to all of that. Civic Square, this is a rendering by Young and Freeman Architects. Roy Simpson was the lead architect, and this was in one of the first reports that the NCDC proposed for what Civic Square might, be visualised as. And you can see that there's a prominent sculpture there, but very much is in evidence in Simpson's ambition for the square was that it be a porous place that many could intervene within. And, pardon me, and I think that Stan's work in 1975 is a really striking example of how the architects would have seen that this square operate. But in the late 60s, the art scene had become a bit of a battleground, and nowhere were the lines more fiercely drawn than around art presented outside conventional gallery walls. I'm just showing you here a clipping from 1966 when Donald Brooke, who had been just about completed his PhD at the ANU, he'd arrived in Canberra late 62, early 63 from the UK, and he had his PhD was in aesthetics, but he'd come from a practice of being a sculptor, and he set up this Australian Sculpture Centre, and it was incredibly ambitious in the way that he described its future. I mean, essentially, though, it was in his own home in Yarralumla, and but he had a very grand opening with an extensive speeches, and you can see this lovely printed card and the kind of ambition that he's got for this. But very much this is sculpture that is commissioned and in place and is part of a building program. Here's Donald here, and above him is a maquette for a work that was actually commissioned by Nugget Coombs for the Reserve Bank building on the other side of London Circuit. If anyone knows where any of these maquettes are, let us know. We know where the original one is. But at the same time, an artist who was not quite born, but certainly had his primary schooling in Canberra, Arthur Wicks. So he'd gone to Ainslie Primary in the 1950s. He'd studied in Sydney, came back to Canberra, working in the public service, but he'd also just come back from a studio residency in Paris. And he proposed this, and he wasn't a particularly religious person, but he did know the chaplain at St Margaret's Chapel in Dixon. So he proposed an alternative Christmas tree. So, it was a substantial work. It was only up for a month, but certainly very much of the period in this kind of minimalist, strong, striking sculptural form. And I think what's also very interesting about this work is its relationship to the architecture of the chapel. And I think for many of us who know the suburbs of Canberra, chapels in the suburbs of Canberra are really some of the architectural gems of the city. But this is really, this image here, and look, I've only putting one in here as the kind of to give you a context. This is really the kind of scene for sculpture in the late 60s in Canberra, and this is the inauguration of the Henry Moore outside the National Library. And I guess you can just read both the body language, the dress, the kind of people who are there. This is the big end of town. This is the money. This is the blue chip. This isn't going to, whilst the artist Henry Moore was certainly a controversial choice in some quarters for this particular work, its siting, and I'm sorry I don't have a shot of it that just shows how beautifully considered the siting of this work is in relation to Mount Ainslie. And I'm sure if many Canberrans know this work very well, the way you look from the work up to Mount Ainslie is a really beautifully considered siting. But it's not really where it was at in terms of contemporary practice. What was going on was, sorry, you'll have to look this up yourself, but this is, I was just going to show you a couple of seconds from it. This is Philip Noyce documenting the Aquarius Festival in 1971 on the ANU campus. And hopefully I might try and get this playing for you later on, and you can just see a bunch of people, and Stephen sort of thinks that he might be one of them in there, romping around, covered in a kind of greeny paint, basically tearing at the audiences, and really it's an indication of this is actually not art that you stand back and look at. This is art that you're really engaging with. But traditionalists like Elwyn Lynn, who occupied quite influential critical and curatorial roles, declared such things happenings, environments and protest stunts are rather curious events from a psychological point of view, but from an aesthetic one, they are just rubbish. So the kind of battle lines were really quite strongly drawn. But despite the limitations of the local art scene at the time, where there wasn't a really properly functioning art school just yet, or a permanent public gallery, Canberra seemed to be acutely ready to present such work. The young modern city, with its wide spaces and the very lack of a precedent, seemed to embolden a new generation of artists and directors to make things happen. One of the few local artists, as I said, was Arthur Wicks, and with his work. But also our first speaker after me will be Bruce Reynolds, who captured an opportunity to present work for Sculpture 75. Sculpture 75 was part of Australia 75, and aside from the 2013 Centenary Festival, it's hard to find another festival program in Canberra's history that was so wide-ranging. Its title, Something for Everyone, and I've just got there one little page of it, but you can see there's science, visual arts and happenings. And there was also a really huge children's festival. Sidney Nolan was here, and that was the first time that his works were shown at Lanyon. Marsha Hines sang. It was a jam-packed 10-day event. I guess the largesse of the Whitlam years enabled that program to happen. So with all of this activity going on, there was a kind of obvious blurring between the ability to stumble across something that might be that you might sort of book to go to, but you can see from the kind of programming that there was a lot of opportunity to just bump into things. And for my own memory as a sort of 12, 13-year-old, I do have a memory of not really understanding what I was seeing, but just like, oh, what was that? And so it was a kind of confusion, but kind of interest, and that's my own sort of very hazy memory of that time. The Whitlam dismissal ended plans for a second festival in 1977, but a year later, Ingo, here's the some of the sites for Sculpture 75 that was there at Commonwealth Park, just across the road here. Work by Tony Colling, Inga King. So yes, so the Whitlam dismissal ended plans for a second festival in 77, but a year later, Ingo Kleinert, who had become head of sculpture at the new Canberra School of Art with Diana Ashcroft Johnson, and with a budget of $3,500 from the Arts Council, launched Act 1, followed in 2-year intervals by Acts 2 and 3. And these can really also be read as a growing confidence for more provocative performance and public participatory art events. Whereas in Sculpture 75, most of the works, apart from Bruce Reynolds and Andrew Townsend's work, had largely come from the Mildura Sculpture Festival. So one of the key works, and I'm sorry, Elspeth was probably going to be the one to really mostly talk about this, but I've just included a few slides here. A key work in this was Mike Parr's work called Dream 1, where he cast himself on the lake in a small dinghy and stayed out all night on the water, the boat drifting on its own. This physically humble work, documented in these grainy black and white photographs, was a purposeful critique of the giant artificial body of water of the lake. And he wrote, "I was very interested in the idea of the collective unconscious. I thought, it's amazing. Here's Canberra with the great problem of trying to relate to the country, and they go and build an ersatz unconscious right in the middle of it. I thought I would drift on the lake and come up with a dream that's going to make it all right." And I encourage you to do a deep dive into the Mike Parr archive, which is in the National Gallery archive. Like most of the previous events, women artists are in a distinct minority, and it wasn't really until the sculpture forums of 1995 and 98 that closer to equal representation was achieved. So here's more of Mike. So this is the video work, I think, that should play.
An annual sum which, until
this is a work that was presented in 1978. It's a video installation by Arthur Wicks. So Arthur's come back after presenting his work 10 years earlier with more kind of conventional sculptural form. He's whispering the words of the dismissal, and visitors were in, it was a kind of box that was by the lake, and you had to peek through, and you could just see him doing this whispering. So, and this is a compilation video that he's made. So it was a durational piece that went for a number of hours, and yeah, you just came in and just put your eye to the peepholes to watch him reading this work out. Arthur's unable to be with us today. He's in Wagga and got some had to be in hospital. But I look forward to sharing more information about Arthur's works in Canberra. He was a very active participant over a number of years in Canberra. So now on to our speakers. Bruce Reynolds is an artist who's now based in Queensland, but was born in Canberra. Studied at the ANU and the Victorian College of the Arts, and at Griffith University. And his, I guess, the opportunity to revisit this, I guess, perhaps some of the earliest work you might have made, Bruce, out of school, is a rare opportunity to see a kind of archive and an engagement. So, Bruce Reynolds.
Last week I was speaking about my work, and I was talking about the archaic in particular. This time I'll start with 55 years ago, and then when I walked from Narrabundah to Civic prior to the lake being filled, walked along the lake rock wall, which was complete, past the paddocks where the National Gallery and the High Court, etc., would later arrive. 45 years ago was when Australia 75 took place, and when a friend, Andrew Townsend, and I accepted a commission to make a work, perhaps the only local work in retrospect for oh yeah. But before that, I just wanted to create a sense of what was going on there. First of all, how recently the paddocks were there prior to them being filled. It was barely 10 years earlier. But then by leading up immediately to 1975. It was music, really, that set the tone and pace of progressive inquiry in the arts leading up to Australia 75 in places like the Albert Hall, the Canberra Theatre, and at the ANU. Would be fascinated to see that video of Aquarius, where I had attended as a teenager, and to hear Stephen talk about Synchronos 72. these were part of a kind of a renewal of the arts, where there was a certain amount of tension between electronics and synthesizers in relation to more traditional influences in sculpture. For example, Henry Moore and David Smith come to mind via the sculpture teachers at the Canberra School of Art. This image is, oh yes, it's titled, that's in the courtyard of the School of Art in 1975. One of the people I remember there is Mike Desmond, who's sort of dressed as a character from the Phantom comics that he liked so much. Tony Twigg is another artist that I remember. He's in there. I'm sure others could pull it apart a little more. Robert Parr was a sculpture teacher that, and this is an image of one of his works being installed in the Commonwealth Gardens. Many of the artists of my generation, young artists, were pondering this space in between music and art, and the Stanislaw Kurkovsky's work articulated this idea with Don Banks at Synchronos 72, and we saw it, and at Australia 75. I saw his work. I was very interested in it, as I say, because of this space, and I was critical and remembered responding very positively to the work. Some of these memories are clearly vague, others are quite pointed. Strangely, I remember sitting through a Sculthorpe work next door called Love 200 that was that I was less excited about. But the event of Synchronos 72, I should say, was it exuded a spirit and an optimism that was contagious, and I think that was what really set the scene for what we were doing in or my approach to Australia, the work for Australia 75. In a broader context, what had been set up was really the big works such as Christo's Little Bay, Charlotte Moorman and Namjoon Pike, along with the music, the Australian music that included bands like Company Cocaine, Mackenzie Theory, Bakery, Sirius, Sanctuary, and others. Most of those had played in Aquarius in 71. And together they informed and empowered an aesthetic response to the formalism of New York abstraction, an alternative, that had a psycho-narrative residue that shared a debt with contemporary music. That is to say, a mood made into an aesthetic quest. At least that's how I saw it as a 19-year-old. Oh, I'll just catch up with myself a little. I've gone. So, Bert Flugelman was one of the sculptors that made work at Australia 75. I was quite excited to meet all these sculptors from around Australia, actual fully engaged artists. And he was very generous. When we bumped into him in Commonwealth Park, he was very generous and spoke. We had an interesting conversation, some of which stayed with me. His Platonic solids beneath Burley Griffin's Canberra were retrospectively a pitch for a National Gallery commission, which of course he eventually completed. He praised the skills of the earthwork movers and And he was very incisive in his comments about being an artist in Australia at that time, and he was very welcoming to us very young artists and to our approach to making work on that occasion. With benefit of hindsight, his attitude suggested an interest in universal principles. There was a code of paired embossed domes on each of the components to evoke the fundamentals of language, and that reminded me of the Voyager golden record that was sent into space, I think a year later, that included Bach and Chuck Berry and a couple of other things etched into its surface. Flugelman was obviously familiar with Burley Griffin's work, both in Canberra and Sydney, and the idea of buried civilisations, I think, was important to him. I'm thinking of the Piermont incinerator and also Michael Heiser's Lost City in Nevada, if one can recall that piece. His work was intended to imply a communion with humanity. It was in sense a different take on a temporal work. It was pretty pointedly intended to last forever. It was. I vaguely remember that he made light reference to that kind of permanence and the obscurity, and trying to making reference to an audience that would remain unknown to him into the future. I suspect he'd like it to have been seen as an intuitive response to Michael Heiser and the Egyptians. The work that I made certainly made me aware for the first time, when looking back, that documentation is quite important. I shot half a roll of black and white film. Matt Kelso, a photographer from the National Gallery, has images, but I'm afraid I wasn't getting hold of them wasn't timely. And my co-artist Andrew Townsend. It's a shame that he couldn't have been here to add his perspective to this. But in this commission that I think we were actually approached at art school. I don't know why we were singled out particularly, but we were basically invited to put a proposal forward, and the idea that we gave them in drawing form was of more interest and was selected above the proposal of an established Sydney abstract painter. The installation that Andrew and I were commissioned to make occupied the 50-metre pedestrian tunnel to the Commonwealth Gardens, and was produced with the assistance of Parks and Gardens, who also employed numerous art students, incidentally, and it utilised several tonnes of trees harvested from the city streets and parks, and it's centred between the two pedestrian tunnels on an inverted room that we built in the middle. This is a picture of myself, and on the left my co-artist Andrew Townsend preparing and trimming these trees to install in the tunnel. We approached the tunnel. So this assistance, I should say, offered by various departments in Canberra at the time was really crucial to realising the work, and that level of cooperation is something that all artists, I think, now value very highly when it can be achieved. We approached the long twin tunnel site as a linear narrative of the unexpected, a winding forest pathway leading to the inverted room that had a tiled ceiling distorted by the curved tunnel vault, giving an effect that we felt was reminiscent of a wide-angle lens. The room was furnished with an iron bed, a chair and an alarm clock. I saw the work as an opportunity to extend my interest in axes and symmetry in the city plan, in the body, in action, time, with an implied narrative. I had around the same time in the painting studio at art school organised a tug of war along an axis between the figurative and non-figurative painters that was marked out on the studio floor, making use of a heavy jute rope I'd previously found. With hindsight, the work showed some of the attitude that you could see in gatefold record covers, and reminds me now of the Ilya Kabakov's narrative of expanded space in The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment, if you can bring that to mind. This is a couple of people walking through. Everyone that entered the Commonwealth Park had to go via these two tunnels and this room. The centre space I should describe, that's the other artist. The centre space that you arrived at, this is the tunnel half full of, it was actually jam-packed with a winding pathway in between all these trees. Arriving at a centre space that was full of vegetation and a large steel prism that we suspended in the space at head height, to incredibly dangerous thing to do. I think I was the first victim of it. But children, the point I think in our minds was that children were safe, but adults would be challenged. That's us. After about 10 days of installation work, it culminated in an informal event in the Constitution Avenue side of the Commonwealth Gardens, where House in the Forest was kindly opened one Friday night by James Mollison. He ceremoniously declared our contribution to the festival open to the soundtrack of Relayer, an album by Yes that was being played on a turntable one of us had brought in. This kind of recollection also made me think of a tour that he took half a dozen art students on through the Fishwick facility that stored the National Gallery collection prior to it being built. So where the Tiepolo and the Warhol and all these other pieces cohabited in a tin shed in the Molonglo Mall. I think we benefited in getting this work from an appetite for interdisciplinary work amongst all of the welded steel. The welded steel that included the work of probably the only female artist, Inga King. Would that be right? It was an opportunity to realise, it was an opportunity to realise a personal vision in proximity to all these other artists of repute, and that was visible to such a large audience. The Canberra public was a great mix and gave us an awareness of an actual rather than theoretical audience. It really did create a sense of what was possible and why, and a context for making art into the future. And last week I was thinking, well, what are one of the tangible relationships between that work and what I went on to do in public art, in temporal and more permanent forms, was this kind of an implication of narrative. And I realised that this is a photograph of an installation in the Museum of Brisbane, or probably 10 or 15 years ago, I think 2007, that created by using cornice around a wall and making a picture out of the carpet that was inlaid onto the floor. It was another version of that inverted room, I think. And a similar work that was using pattern and generated from a collage kind of narrative was this piece made on the beach at Noosa some years earlier. And this is Brisbane Magistrates Court. So there were these kind of continuing personal themes of where, like the slightly fairy tale aspect of the house in the forest, the strewing of Grey Street with oversized jewels that were made of domestic patterns has some of those same elements in a public space 35 years later. Just by the way, there's one of my pictures. I've tended to make a lot of work on lino, which is yet another domestic pattern that's carried on in the work that's currently up in next door in CMAG, that one. And Virginia suggested that this is also this is a current show in the Tweed that is much more about the archaic than the recent. But I look forward to hearing Stephen talk about the bits that I have not covered. Thanks very much.
Well, this afternoon, as Bruce and Stephen have been kind of having a little bit of a look at what each other's talking about, it's been interesting to kind of have that sense of the slipperiness of memory and connection. So welcoming Stephen Jones. Stephen lives in Sydney but has had time in Canberra here as a kind of formative time, studying and then I guess getting into electronica. He's gone on to become a leading historian, archivist, curator of Australian media art. He's published extensively, has PhD, and he really manages some very significant archives. So welcome, Stephen.
This period, 1971 to 1975, was one in which there was quite an extraordinary amount of interest, and particularly in Canberra, interest in electronics in the arts and other forms of experimental art. So what we saw was a series of, one of the things that we saw, I was actually at ANU from 69 to 73. There was this thing that ANU ran called the Creative Arts Fellowships, and the particular ones that I'm going to focus on is the middle one, Stan Kurkovsky. I can actually get the mouse to, if I can make it behave in backwards. But there was Arthur and Corinne Cantrell, who were filmmakers who worked in expanded cinema. So they opened up the whole notion of the visual into the installation and did performances that were effectively using lots of bits of film and stuff and combining them with various other media and making big events out of it. So they were kind of sort of cinematic, but much more than just cinematic. Then Stanisław Kurkovsky, who was a Polish immigrant who came out to Australia in 1949. He was a post-war immigrant refugee from Poland at the time, and he came and lived in Melbourne for a while, then moved to Adelaide, and then he got the fellowship in '71, and then there was Donald Banks, who was a new music, well, in those days, new music composer, who also brought one of the very first audio synthesizers that we saw, other than the Moog, out of England when he came from England, and that was a really important thing. But we're not going to talk much about Arthur and Corinne. Anyway, so a lot of what I've said is this. So it was a pretty remarkable period. H.C. Coombs, who kind of did a lot of work in getting things like the Australia Council going and stuff like that, were really, really valuable. And so Corinne and Arthur were using multimedia film forms to and sound and performance and poetry reading and all of that kind of stuff all at once inside a big kind of melee that was going on at in some space. And they showed in the one of the lecture theatres at ANU a number of times. They had a number of big shows there, but I'm not going to talk too much about them. Now, Stan is who I'm really going to talk about. He was working in a form that he called sound and light, which was really a synesthetic form. He used visual light-based light projections and light media of varying kinds to project it onto the big screens on the stage, for example, or in various other locations. He started off as a theatre designer, so once he was here in Australia, he started off as a theatre designer. And so he took the theatre work and blew it up into a much more interesting and much more diverse kind of idea. The other person who I'm going to talk about, who I'm going to mention briefly, is Donald Banks, who was a composer, and he got involved with Stan. I've got 2 copies of that. And they gave so that's just summing up Stan's origins here. And then he was making mostly expressionist abstract work, and then he started doing very, very detailed op art work. And while he was working in the theatre, doing theatre staging, and he had, the evidence suggests that he had, and he claims it himself, that he was synesthetic, that he would see the sounds as lights and things like that. So he certainly made that a major part of his process, and his work was to actually make the sound and the light work as a single process, a single thing, whatever you could call it, artwork, I suppose, but a single event, a single performance. And so he brought a bunch of different ways of making this kind of sound and light, audio-visual synthesis kind of stuff going on. But in '71, he had got the Creative Arts Fellowship. He was, and the first thing he did, there was a festival in '71, which was just mentioned before, which was the Aquarius Festival. So '71 Aquarius Festival happened here. The later one, the next one was at Nimbin in '73. But the festival in '71 happened in the main paddocks around between the Union and the library and the different lecture theatres and things. So there was that big paddock in the ANU in those days, and it's where everybody hung out, and there were demonstrations and all of that kind of stuff at various times. So for the Aquarius Festival, Stan built a thing called the Chromosonic Tower. The architect for the mast itself was a man called Derek Rigney. And you can see here that they're sort of building, there's people up and down the thing, getting stuff lit up and getting stuff attached and locked in and stuff. So that's what it kind of looked like from the once it was established, and you can see that it's very tall, and it was tied down by guy ropes so that it wasn't going to blow over and cause a disaster. And the man in the suit at the front is Stanisław Kurkovsky. So he was pretty proud of his work. So the Chromosonic Tower, this is probably the most useful picture. What they built was essentially a set of columns of lights that ran up the tower on the 3 or 4 corners of it. I think it was only 3. I think it was triangular. Looking at the cross beams, it's probably triangular. There was often a jazz band playing, but otherwise there was just music. But when the music was on and the band was playing or something like that, the lights would turn on and off according to the volume and the frequency, so that you can see that they're coloured lights, and they would change into blues and greens and things like that as well. And but the volume would drive it up the column, and it would settle down again as things settled down, and then it would drive it up the column again, and so on like that. So that was a pretty amazing little thing. That's a close-up of the thing, so you can in fact see that it is triangular. There's and that's that is a multiple exposure thing that was in a photograph that was taken of it. So it was pretty impressive, and it was because it was so huge. And then these are photographs that Stan took, this next 3, I think. Stan was interested in the use of things like lenses and bits of glass and stuff like that to distort the light before it hit the camera or before it hit the projection or whatever. So he would use sheets of bits of glass, or all kinds of weird lenses and things like that. And so these photographs were taken from that. And you can see that he's got different kinds of lenses that he was using. And that's a great one, because it just has this, this sphere of light bursting out of the thing, out of the tower. And then, while he was as a Creative Arts Fellow, he also worked with the Research School of Physical Sciences Electrical Engineering Workshop, and he built he had asked them to build for him these things which are called laser chromosons, and now these have actually got small lasers. These are a sphere. This is the one. Yeah, you can see that it's really hard doing the mouse when you turn around backwards to it. That's a sphere of perspex, blown perspex. So what you do is that you lay a sheet of perspex on, and you drop it onto a mould, and you heat it up, and you pull all the air out with a vacuum, and that makes the perspex sink into the spherical form. And all the electronics for controlling the motors that drove the lasers, and for controlling the motors that drove the lenses, and also for changing the colours and all of that kind of stuff were in this pack here. And there were 2 of these built. They were, and sadly neither of them now exist. One of them was taken back to Adelaide and is still physically exists, but probably will never be put back into operational order. The other one was given to the university, And they should be shot for this. The building manager of the building that it was installed in just swept in and threw all the artworks out of the foyer of the building and dumped them. And they didn't even put them in the archive. They just threw them out, put them in a skip and threw it all out. And, you know, it should be totally, I mean, don't do it, please. It's just not there's no point in doing it, you know. You erase history. Anyway, my polemic that'll do. So you can see that this was a really, did lots of very interesting non-linear, rectilinear, soft and images that were really just like the lasers all being mixed together on the internal reflective surface at the back of the thing, and the front surface, the one we're looking at, of course, is transparent, except for those rings around it, which you can see there, and they just give it a kind of visual shape, form thing for him, you know. So that was pretty impressive stuff, and you can see more of that there. So the next thing was this thing called Synchronous 72. Now this is where he collaborated with Donald Banks. Donald Brooks, another entirely different level of entity. They put together a concert of audiovisual material, and so this is the program for it. That's a kind of, you know, PR type shot of standing in front of the instruments, and you know, you can see that there's actually I think that's an early Moog, I'm not sure. There's a VCS, there's an EMS, probably a VCS3. There's various other things. There's also lots of laser stuff. There's a huge screen up here, and that's all playing away. So they played all of those things for various things, and you can see again the size of the scale of the thing, and those are the VCS3s on the bottom right there. And if I can get this to work, we might. Oh no, that didn't work. I have to do it this way, I think. Yes, here we go. Oh, we're not hearing it.
Audiences listen to specially written music played on a wide range of conventional and unconventional instruments. More than 1,000 visual images dance before their eyes. Called synchronous because of the synchronization of light and sound, the concert represents the combined talents of a composer, Don Banks, and an artist, Stan Kurkovsky. Their experiments in music, art, and electronics were conceived while both men were attending the Australian National University on Creative Arts Fellowships. According to the composers, nothing is as brilliant or as beautiful as the light of a laser. They link projectors and special optical devices with their laser machines to translate music into color, shape, and form. Then the images are beamed onto 6 screens inside the concert hall. A complete performance of Synchronous lasts 1.5 hours. The musical score has parts for clarinet, horn, cello, piano, organ, and percussion. Added to this are synthetic music, singing, pre-recorded chamber music, and of course the laser beams.
All right, we'll stop it there. So we should get on to the next step, which is the actual Australia 75 thing and the Chromosonic Tower and that, which was a laser Chromosonic Tower, this one. So that's it being built. Virginia's already shown you a image of what this became, and you can see that it was put into the Civic Square here, and I think they've changed the pools and things all since then and stuff. So and they're building it and building it and building it, and there it is, and it's on. So it's above this pool of water, and so it's got all this lovely reflection off it and stuff like that. It's full of lasers, so they're distorted lasers. They're put through bits of glass and onto that. You saw that in the video. You saw him with that sort of sheet of or sort of circle of steel or whatever it was, reflective material, and he was, so he used that kind of stuff to actually distort the laser output so that it became spread across and diverged across all of the different surfaces that were there. And of course there was sound synthesizers in there and stuff like that, and they were playing it, and there's a shot of that in a minute. But this was, so it went through all kinds of different colour stages and things like that. That's a brief description of what was in it. So there were, it was lasers, incandescent lights, chromosonics, scanners responded to sound from 40 speakers surrounding the square. So they were, so it was a big thing when it here. It was like just, it was totally enveloping, and it took over the square, and of course everybody was really blown away by it. And of course at the time everybody was here for various kinds of interesting and experimental art forms and stuff. So there was a lot of people who kind of hadn't quite been able to experience this stuff until this point, and it was a big new experience for a lot of people. So there it is again, and it even hit the front cover of that's a great PR shot basically. And that's just another shot of it more in the daylight, so it's finished and it's ready to, it's running. So, but it really ran mostly at night because of course it's light, so you can't see it during the day very easily. More notes on it, as Stan says, this is Stan's actually his own handwriting. The tower translated the music into colours, shapes and kinetics. Which was basically moved. So that's the interior where all of the technology was, and that's Stan there. I don't know who that is, but you can see that he's working with various bits of control stuff, and there's all kinds of amplifiers and motor drivers and all of the things that you need to make something like that happen. And then this is some other shots of those things, and I think these are actually Stan's photographs as well. That's the light reflectors and stuff, and he had lots of laboratory clamps and stuff like that he would use to support the reflectors in various ways. And then that's the audio department, as you might call it, and some otherwise massive power supply to drive the motors that drove the lasers and things, mixer and stuff, probably a big amplifier, cassette tapes to play back. I don't think there's a synthesizer in this one. He did get a synthesizer later, but that's not at this point. And then more of the lights and the incandescent lamps, just standard theatre lamps and stuff, and some people who is working with assistants and so on, working on it. And that's really it. So the rest of it would be another talk.
Thank you. I think, just seeing those images of the Bert Flugelman, Caterpillar truck and things like this, the idea of risk and safety,
Oh yeah, well,
some evolutions of that. Now, we're just going to have a little shift in the, we were going to have a little break, but we're cancelling the break because we've run a little bit over time, but we need to speak to Richard Lure, who's in Melbourne right now. Richard, of course, is, well, he's got a little bit more freedom now, coming out of the pandemic, but he needs to be somewhere else sort of shortly. So we're going to hear from him first and then from Lara. So I'll be operating Richard's slides. And hopefully we've got Richard on Zoom.
Okay, into a microphone.
Hi, Richard, are you there? Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Hi. Welcome to Canberra. Thank you for joining us, Contour 556. And of course, some of us have already just had a look at your work out at Civic Square. Of course, you haven't been, but you've been able to see the work in photographs. I've just put up an image of you in your studio there, so that people can kind of see, I guess, a little bit of your space. So just tell us briefly where you are and what you're up to just there now.
Yeah, so I'm in Melbourne. I'm a Melbourne-based artist. Is that sound okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Is that loud enough? Okay. Yeah, so I'm Melbourne-based. That's my studio in Northcote. So that's pretty much at the start of lockdown. I was working on a series of paintings called Richard's Disasters. So there's a lot of disasters there. I guess in a way, like I turned sort of 50 this year, and I looking at my life and what's occurred over my life, and there's been a lot of, I guess, extreme events and disasters, and I guess those have shaped me. So I wanted to sort of document those, and it was a good time to sort of be locked down and just to document those. They're on brass, copper and steel. They range right through to sort of the work in the back of me wearing grey uniform. It was a mufti school, but my mother dressed me up in grey uniform for some unknown reason. Myself, after getting dumped by my first girlfriend, electrical storms. So different events that have shaped me. So it's just, I guess in a way we put this in there just to sort of show what I'm working on right now.
Sounds like a work of our times. So I guess because our conversation today is around art in the public domain, and so we're looking at both legacies and futures, I guess your work is part of our present. And your work sits here on Civic Square. We've just been looking at a work from 1975 that was presented in Civic Square. And this gallery space that we call CMAG on the Square, that's supported by John Hindmarsh, allows, I guess, CMAG's programming to bleed onto the square through this glass vitrine. So I guess, can you talk to us a little bit about the concept for this work and how you saw it relating to that Civic Square area?
Yeah, I guess in a way, for a start, it's really, I like working on materials that have a history or have their own sort of, their own purpose. Like, so this was a flag actually flown in Canberra at the Parliament. So it's already got its stories attached to it. It's already been a used object. I've used objects in the past like flags, maps, pool tables, so other things that are not necessarily things to make work on, but I tend to enjoy the challenge, I guess, in a way, of working with the history of these objects. So there's no bigger, I guess, history and sort of the context of the flag and what to put on it. You know, like when I actually purchased the flag, the lady said, "Well, you're not going to burn it, eh? You know, you're not allowed to do that." So there automatically there was sort of rules attached to it, and so like there's no way I would want to burn such a beautiful flag. It's absolutely, you know, amazing. It's distressed. It's been worn. You know, they change their flags every sort of 4 months because they get belted around so badly. With the text, it always takes me a long time to sort of work out what to put on it, and it's hard to sort of stand back and say this is exactly what my intentions are with the text, because I feel like it's almost like a song or something that it can relate to people in different ways. Like it's both social, political, autobiographical, and so it is a marry of those sorts of approaches that will give me the text in the end. And you know, putting it out into a public arena is really rewarding, because you're going to get a lot of people seeing things not in a gallery or an art context. And these things, like the school maps that I've used and the flags, they are functional objects. So yeah, it just adds another layer to things, and it adds another narrative to the work that I can't necessarily control.
And I guess the work, you know, when you read it or look at it, it has a darkness to it. But I guess in that sense that you're wanting people to, I guess, have multiple readings of it, or not necessarily, you know, they don't know your story or what is, you know, to I guess bring themselves to what you're saying there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the other flag work that I've done is I must learn to like myself. So immediately people, you know, like it's talking about it's talking about liking myself, or that autobiographical trait. When I look at the I can't run away all my life work, you know, like immediately I think of a young girl that I box. I'm a boxing trainer. And, you know, like she's been bullied for the last 12 months at school, and it's something that we've been talking about. So immediately I think about this. I think about the China conversation. So the things go into, they have different layers and different meanings. And that's what I love. That's when I go that's the work finished, when the text can actually reach people in different aspects, rather than sort of me putting my own personal baggage onto the work.
And as an artist, you know, from elsewhere, from Melbourne and also New Zealand, when you came and did your recce around Canberra, you know, just thinking more broadly about Canberra as a place for seeing art in the public domain and experiencing it, what were some of the things that went through your mind? Because I think what's interesting, I think for many people in encountering making work in Canberra, Canberra has that dialectic between being, you know, the national capital, but also being a place that, you know, there's now 3 or 4 generations of locals here. So that tension between the national agendas and the local. Did you have any sort of consideration for things like that when you were thinking about your work for here?
I did, and it got kind of quite hard to sort of separate in a way because of that national discussion. And also what I was talking about with Neil was really a response to the parade and the sculptures and the the military story. So it was interesting that I wanted to talk about that because my work has gone into that sort of avenue before, and I'm familiar with telling stories. And so, but it was interesting because there was a number of sculptures, there's a number of stories going on, and I wanted to I tried to encapsulate that in one work, which was almost kind of too tricky to do. And I remember emailing Neil and sort of saying, does it have to be based around the parade? And he was like, no, like it is a response. And it's like, yes, this work can sit alongside the parade. Like when you say fight, you think of, other things about war and a country and nationalism and things like that, but it does sit on another level as well. And that's what I wanted. But I think going back to your question too, it's tricky when you come and do a recce and then things get a little bit skew with COVID and you can't come back and relook at things, and that's been this year.
No, not running away. Well, look, thank you, Richard. This is just another detail I'm just putting up there, and I just wanted to ask you about a couple of works that you sent me. This one of the magpies attacking, that would have a very strong resonance for Canberrans, and the one of the pack of dogs circling the tent.
That's the horses. So that's part of the Richard's disasters as well. So I said to my wife that horses don't like me, and she was like, "Oh, don't be silly, nonsense." And this was a new year in New Zealand. and we woke up to galloping horses around our tent. We poked our little heads out, and sure enough, there was it's half a dozen horses trotting around us at full speed. And then the other one was the Magpie Attacks. And I guess in a way, people have had these sort of connections to, well, not so extreme, but they're not unheard of, like with the Canberra Magpies and things like that. So they are kind of everyday, in a way, events. And it's just like, again, this is what I'm just working on at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard, for contributing today. I know you've got to go, but we really appreciate your work here at CMAG on the Square and your participation in Contour 556. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, I couldn't be there in person, but thank you.
I'd now like to welcome Lara Nichols. Lara is currently undertaking a PhD at the ANU, but she's been a curator at the National Gallery of Australia, and she's going to, I guess, if we go back to where we've just left off about the story of Stan in 1975, Lara's taking us, I guess, probably the next couple of chapters on in terms of some of the public artworks and presentations that were done in Canberra, but also, I guess, really drawing out some of the key legacies from some of these events. Lara.
It was really wonderful to hear from Stephen and Bruce about all of those, in sort of granular detail that their archive has about those events for Sculpture 75, because I've been researching through that material, and it's so exciting to look at it, but it's really hard to actually get a real sense of it. So to actually hear from people who were there and presenting work was actually really exciting. So thank you both, that was great. I'd also just like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people before I begin on whose land we meet. We need to continually sort of renew our connection to the traditional owners of this land and to remember how beautiful it is at all times. So going back in time now to the 60s and 70s, it wasn't really just one thing that rearranged the public's perception of sculpture in the 1960s and 70s in Australia. It was a remarkable moment of many things intertwined and confluent that transformed the period into one of the most ambitious periods in Australian art history. Those key events were the Mildura Sculpture Triennials and the Sculpturescape that started in 1973 there, which was largely headed up by Tom McCulloch, Sculpture 75, which we've heard about, the foundation of the NGA Sculpture Garden, which opened in 1982, and also there was a little, Virginia mentioned it, the Australian Sculpture Centre in Canberra, founded in 1966. By Donald Brooke. And then, of course, the Sydney Biennale, which really Tom McCulloch became one of the directors there, and that was also another major sort of pivotal moment. But I'm mostly going to talk about the National Gallery of Australia's Sculpture Garden. I thought it was better to go in deeper than to go broad. But I will have passing references to the other events that took place. But the key conclusion that I've come to from looking through all of these events is that ambitious sculpture, the sculpture needed for public spaces, is a high cost and very much a high stakes medium to work with. And because of that, it's really dependent on government and private philanthropic support. And without that, you can't really do ambitious work. In essence, if government are motivated to support sculpture, remarkable things really can happen, as we have seen going through the archive. In Canberra, it's a pretty small city, but probably has more sculpture per capita than perhaps any other city in the world. And we have been very ambitious here previously. Everyone knows Marjal Hinder's fabulous work at Woden. Norma Redpath on King Edward Terrace, you can see an image of that work installed on King Edward Terrace. And more recently at ANU, Wolfgang Buttress, the work Una, which he did in collaboration with Daniel Bayliss, who's an astrophysicist. It also shows that wonderful connection, which I think Stephen really touched on in terms of that collaboration between the university and artists in the arts and the art school as well. It's very sort of really fabulous and wonderful sort of unique confluence that occurs there. The other conclusion I've arrived at is that many of these leading sculpture events that led to such a sort of high energy period in Australia and to the patronage indeed, there was one other key ingredient, and that was water, and that's why I titled my talk Lakes, Rivers and Oceans. It seems to be that water generates a desire to place sculpture near it. Lake Burley-Griffin, the Murray River in terms of Mildura, the Pacific Ocean, etc. And even, not so long ago, I was the artistic director of the Lawn Sculpture Biennale, where we needed to wrangle with that incredible landscape, which is so dominated by the ocean and that liminal space between the bush. And it sort of began for Australia in some ways. We sort of suddenly moved away from memorials with Christo. In 1969, Christo and Jean-Claude, they selected a section of Gadigal coastline south of Maroubra in New South Wales, and they wrapped Little Bay. The director of many of the Mildura sculpture triennial, Tom McCulloch, paid respect to their influence when he referred to the new environment for sculpture that led to the NGA garden as a post-Christo landscape, in which an Australian public gallery becomes totally concerned with the outstillation, and that's his word, of important works which define and react to a set environment. There were, of course, other international equivalents that we're all familiar with. Of course, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty of 1970. So all of these things sort of happening at that time and percolating through. These types of outstallations in the landscape really set the benchmark for the ambitious outdoor public art event. They did something else that flavoured the times. These artists connected the installation of art on the land into art that becomes landscape. Tom McCulloch took it one step further when he coined the phrase sculpturescape to reference this seepage between nature and human-made forms. And indeed at Lawn, the founding committee there decided to pay homage to Tom McCulloch's work, and they have a section in that event called Sculpturescape, which is for land artwork. You can't really make a better term than that. They couldn't really make another one up that was just too good, so they borrowed it. McCulloch made a characteristic element of the Mildura Sculpture Triennale in 1973 when he took on some sort of forgotten marshy river flats, now the Rio Vista parklands in Mildura, and that's where he placed Sculpturescape. Again, water was necessary. Today I'm going to present this idea that Canberra as a progressive space for invention and creativity fueled a major revival in Australian sculpture in the 1970s, and I really think that we've just heard all about how that happened and seen, which is, when you think of what Stanislaw Kostalska was producing, you realise how ambitious that really was. It was a major revival, and so the National Gallery was a major part of that revival, along with these sister events, and it played a critical role not in only watering that seed, but in pushing the scope and ambition of such a program. So first, let us begin with the ground upon which we stand in the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri country. Despite our Western habit of encroaching on country with built schemes, which in the West we call design and development and architecture, the soul of Ngunnawal land seems to keep showing us its presence no matter how much we pave and construct on top of that. Upon that country, Anglo-Australia constructed its institutions such as the High Court and the NGA. The building program of both edifices being significantly interwoven, as you can see in that image on the left, when you see that, that vision through Lake Burley-Griffin to this sort of land of cranes and almost built buildings, transforming that sort of Ngunnawal land. And of course the lake, of course, being another of those impositions in its own right. But when I was at the gallery, or before I was at the gallery, they did have, of course, that remarkable work, the New Zealand work, the globe, which of course was hit by lightning and fell down. And I think sometimes we try to impose things and then nature takes them back again from us. Those buildings were designed by Cole Madigan, as many know, in that international brutalist style, using concrete in massive vertical forms reaching up into the sky, strong, stable and impervious structures, fortress-like, protective, but at the same time impenetrable. If anyone's seen early photographs, and I'll show you some in a minute, of that land at the time of their construction will know that the ground below looks very flat and unvegetated and cleared. out of the dust and rubble stand these two very precise, very tall, very concrete buildings, and it was very marked at the time, that sort of imposition that occurred on the landscape. The other corresponding feature is that Cole Madigan worked closely with artists in the conception, as is evidenced by this classic photograph. That's Jan Sandberg's on the left, Cole Madigan in the middle, George Balderson, and of course Les Cossatz, all artists who are involved in both the High Court and the National Gallery of Australia's sculpture program at the time of the building works. And then, of course, another sort of very macho image of Cole standing there with Robert Hughes. It's sort of how major art, public art ran at the time. As we've already alluded to, there was only one woman in Sculpture 75, being Inga King. And I don't think anyone would have had a sculpture event in 1975 without her. So, and so here are some other images from the National Archives website, which I thought you might enjoy, which show exactly that sort of very pared back landscape from which the sculpture garden was placed. And so how do you transition from this sort of built construction to an outside environment? The sculpture garden, its horticultural scheme using indigenous plantings, became an integral part of the softening of the building into that landscape. The inaugural director, James Mollison, started to commission and collect works for the garden from an early stage. For example, Clement Meadmore's monumental work, Virginia, which I hope I have next. Oh no, well, there's Inga King actually on the left. The work on the left is Inga King's Temple Gate, which is now in Bowen Place. So you'll see it when you drive around Bowen Place, the black sculpture that's in the centre. And here, of course, is the Clement Meadmore Virginia. And below is a little maquette that James Mollison gifted to the gallery. It's named after his partner who he met, who came to New York and met him, Virginia Cuppage, who is a geometric abstract painter. He'd been commissioned by the NGA to make the large-scale work for the garden, and the final work was acquired in 1973 but not installed until the first group were installed in 1982. Cole Madigan commissioned the Sydney-based landscape architect Harry Howard, with whom he'd worked previously, to provide what I might call sort of a nesting for the building. Howard was renowned for his preference for using indigenous plants in his designs, and indeed that became a major feature of the sculpture garden and is today. James Mollison said of Cole Madigan and Harry Howard working together that it was Cole implementing the strict geometry that underlies what we are doing, and Harry Howard's team bringing in the necessary informality to our geometry. Of the garden, Harry Howard stated, "As you walk, you will discover them," he means sculptures, in isolation rather than in conflict with other works. The plants would range in texture, spidery to fleshy were the words he used. Trees would frame Virginia, as you can see there. Howard said, Howard's blank canvas was actually 3 hectares of space, facing all 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east and west. Thus, it was decided to use the theme of the 4 seasons as its structure. And I think I might just flip back to there. That's a better one. The Winter Garden, which is where the Burghers of Calais by Auguste Rodin are placed, is in many ways acts as a transition point from the building structure to the bush landscape for the outside world. Albeit it's one that's been successful, this sort of outside world that we have has been successively nationalised with lawns and deciduous trees, but the original plan was for these indigenous plants to grow up and develop and nestle in these sculptures. From the Winter Garden, we move away from the sort of post-impressionist and Art Deco influences that you see in the Winter Garden towards Henry Moore's more abstracted organic forms in the Summer Garden. And then in that courtyard, in that Summer Garden, we also saw the installation of Fujiko Nayaka's Foggy Wake in a Desert, an Ecosphere of 1982, and of course Robert Stackhouse, who is here placing his work on the beach again, which falls away into the water very beautifully amongst all those sort of pine needles that you find there. And there are many other works in that section as well, of course, Robert Klippel being one of them, and Dadang Cristanto. The spring garden that heads down towards the lake contains Virginia, and it also once contained Inga King's Temple Gate. And here we see that the plantings, what the plantings do for the sculpture. The softening of the landscape through moving foliage, trees, bushes tends to enlargen the works. So when you look at Inga King's Temple Gate now in Bowen Place, it had an amazing effect of shrinking when we placed it there, because it came out of this bush setting. But when you place them in the bush setting, it actually enlarges them. And we found the same thing happened at Lawn. If an artist wanted to take a sort of a promontory aspect of the beach, their work shrank. They had to have a really majorly large work. But if you placed it with bushes and trees and other contexts, they became larger. It's a really interesting optical thing that takes place. And then, of course, where is the Autumn Garden? Well, that became the staff car park, which Neil Hobbs told me recently. And how did the NGA Sculpture Garden revive Australian sculpture, you might well ask? Well, the first raft of commissions began in the early 1970s, which was really truly that time of resurgence of interest in those sort of outstallations of works. And the Commonwealth Government provided significant capital for those acquisitions, and many of them were Australian. Of course, there were also international acquisitions. If you like numbers, you'll be interested to know that the budget for the landscaping at the NGA was at 1.3 million, and the High Court was 600,000. It's a pretty significant landscaping budget back then. This confidence and outward support for sculpture really gave artists the green light not to just make sculpture, but to be very ambitious for the practice. And that was one of the words that Malcolm Snow used when we came here tonight, when he talked about the urban renewal, this idea of ambition, which is what you really need for public sculpture events. One of the first things to go in was, in fact, Bert Flugelman's cones, which hopefully will come up next, yes, which was technically a very complex work to make, travel and install. It's comprised of 7 highly polished and linked cones that took 6 years to design and fabricate in South Australia. Brewster and Co in Adelaide had to actually make custom-made equipment to fabricate the work, and each one of them was polished by a special machine made by one man, Neil Craney. They were then covered in protective film, and the work was then transported to Canberra, all 24 metres of it, which required a police escort and travel speeds of no more than 40 kilometres per hour. So this is what I mean about ambitious. Most people say that actually is too much of a nuisance, we're not doing that, but if you want great things like this, it kind of has to happen. And in the year following the Flugelman install, between April and June of 82, the gallery installed the Rodin, the Legacies, Mayol, the Bourdelle, the Marco de Severo, Mead Moore, the Henry Moore, Flugelman, and the Nakaya, Fujiko Nakaya. Others followed shortly after. There were 5 fabulous works from the Pacific, which are the Vanuatu split drums, which you might actually have an interesting image of here in, oh yes, in that middle image you can see the Vanuatu split drums. 12 works from the Tiwi Islands, Pukamani poles, and 4 other Australian artists, 2 of whom were women, 8 French artists, 3 of the 5 eventual Rodin that went in there, 2 American and 1 English. And how does that sit within the sort of broader collecting activities of the gallery at the time? Well, I'm not really sure what the numbers are on the international collection, but one of the last jobs I did over the past year when I was at the gallery was I went through the Australian collection and assessed it. And here are some very interesting statistics which I cobbled together. The key statistics, and I actually put them on a slide, which makes it even easier. There we go. So in the 19th century, unsurprisingly, we only have 53 sculptures in the Australian collection, 615 in the 20th century, and 134 in the 21st century. And the total's about 102. And don't ask why, I don't know that exactly. It's really because of the way things are recorded. Some things are recorded as parts and not the whole, so you can't get the exact granular detail. But the works by women artists are 213 works by women, but 69 women represented in that number. But the interesting thing about that 20th century number is I haven't checked it, but I think about 3/4 of that would be from the last 50 years of the century, maybe even the last 40 years of that century, because James Mollison was really buying artists' work from their studios and from their exhibitions and commissioning. So that was all happening from the 70s, 80s and through to the 90s. And so while I'm not going to talk about Sculpture 75 because that's already been done very well by Bruce, I would like to touch on another work by Bert Flugelman, which Bruce also showed, which remains a subject of much intrigue in Canberra. And I've just got a little bit more information about it, which you might enjoy. It was called Earthwork. And yes, it was that precursor to cones, and it was sort of a bit of a pitch to doing a major public installation. And it caused quite a stir. It consists of 6 very large tetrahedrons. And there he is. We saw that wonderful photograph before. It's worth looking at. And I just want to say that they're very highly polished. So they are very perfect. And in fact, out at the store, there's another Flugelman work called Dice, which has never been shown before. And when I went to catalogue it, the film was still on it, the protective film. So he would have brought those over with protective film, and he's taken it off and then covered it over. I'm hoping that one day they bring that work out and put it on display. But he did say, in one of the newspaper articles, it said that he'd spent a very frustrating week trying to get permission to install them because permission had already been granted, but then powers that be didn't feel that the necessary documentation was in place. So he had to wait a week to start installing it. Once they were reinstated, he excavated a deep trench and placed the forms in a neat row, as you can see, and proceeded to bury them. This was in every way counter to what we know about sculpture and Bert Flugelman's practice, which was by that stage very well known for the installation in public places such as in South Australia. And he was also, as you know, renowned for these pristine surfaces and for this meticulous detail in the fabrication. Thus, to bury the work, which was otherwise had a sort of high visibility and maximum engagement and reflective quality to it, was a step too far for many. People wrote to the Canberra Times complaining. Some thought the work had cost the government $10,000, and there was articles about this at the time. And the comment was the typical sort of thing you get, we're wasting ratepayers' money. It never dies down, that comment. And the coordinator for the event, Tom McCulloch, who was the artistic director for Sculpture 75, who was also the director of the Mildura, wrote a scathing reply to the Canberra Times stating, regarding the concept of earthworks, post-object art and so on, it is easy to sympathise with the layman who are puzzled about the motives behind some contemporary artists, especially those whose recent works do not hang in frames on a wall or pose in the middle of a fountain. And I think that shows that what had happened and what that change was. Australia starts off collecting sculpture as a memorials committee, and we end up having events like Sculpture 75. He goes on to say that Canberra has been fortunate in getting the earthworks as a gift. But if an object-type sculpture is more desirable, I suggest someone should commission one from him. And indeed, that did happen, and the NGA commissioned cones, and production commenced in 1976, the following year. So the point to all this is that these major sculpture events, along with the development of the sculpture garden and the broader collection at the NGA, made a huge impact on Australian sculpture. The NGA did buy works that were shown at the triennials and Sculpture 75. There's more of those great photos that you saw before. And that's actually, that little photo there is of Bert's interpretation. So you'd go up close to it and see all the different stages, photographs of all the different stages of the burying. We bought this work, which is Ty Park's Banner, which was fabulously reinstated by Terence Malone and Tony Oates in an exhibition recently. That was the first time I think it had been shown in Canberra. And another example that I came across, there's also Tony Collings to do with blue, which is another big question we should all talk about. But also Mar Ground's Six Stack, which is another work in the National Gallery that probably no one has looked at. So, these events are really important for the development of sculpture. They're also important for the collection of sculpture on a national level. And as this symposium has this sort of concept of the future, my idea for the future, for what it's worth, is could we consider a major sculpture park at the National Arboretum? It's my best idea for the night. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara. And I think when we're talking legacies, that Flugelman is this unspoken or unseen, but also very, very, very much loved legacy for that the new work that's over there at the National Gallery. Now, a slight other little change in speaker order. We're going to now have Megan Cope, and Megan might need a Torchlight to come up. So just welcoming to the stage, Quandamooka woman, Megan Cope, artist. Yay. Megan, I've known for a little bit. Megan was a wonderful artist in an exhibition called Saltwater Country that co-curated with Michael Aird in 2014, and we made some work on her country back then in Queensland. Megan, of course, is a Contour 556 artist, 566 artist, and she's currently working at Canberra Glassworks, where if you hadn't seen her work already, I think it's going to be there for quite a while. It's just outside the Glassworks near Broodberger. But welcome, thank you so much for coming, Megan, and the stage is yours.
Thanks, Virginia. Okay, lovely. Yeah, thanks for having me. Just also would like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people. I've been here as a visitor for the last 3 weeks at the Glassworks, as Virginia mentioned. I'm aware of the time because tonight the Glassworks is open till 8 to use the workshop, and I'm finishing up, so I'm a bit kind of keen to get back to the lathe. I've fallen in love with glass carving. It's been interesting listening to all this history. My work is also engaged with history. As a Quandamooka woman, I'm kind of really committed to our history and revealing things in my practice and redocumenting or revealing things that are often built over or replaced. And I'm really interested in public art because I enjoy the sense of ownership that people often have with it, and I feel like successful public art is one that everybody falls in love with and kind of sees themselves in. And so this work is sort of an idea I've had for a while. Initially, Neil asked me to bring my Reformation midden work, but it takes about a week to install, and I was sort of, once a year for that install is kind of enough for me. But I had this idea about perforating concrete after spending so much time making sculptures with concrete and then learning about, just how destructive it is and how Western culture is so obsessed with it. I asked Neil if I could do an installation where I perforate the concrete to highlight the process of rendering the earth infertile in a way, and that's kind of what concrete's doing. It's flattening the earth, and it's also changing the direction of water. It's also changing the speed that water travels when it rains. And so for me, perforating the concrete could be a meditation or an opportunity for water to seep through and rest where it should in aquifers in the water table. So I've got a few little time-lapse shots here. Started with measuring up. When I sent Neil the sketch, it was just a drawing over a screenshot from Google Maps with the word in it. And then, of course, it's quite challenging once you are in the physical space and it's a completely different dimension. So after measuring it up very carefully, spacing each of the dots, we got some people to come and with a drill core, diamond head, and take out the cores in the pathway to spell the word Wallangalla, which means long water in Jundai language, which is the language from Stradbroke Island. I really love these. This was sort of like an unexpected gift in a way, and I was immediately reminded of frog eggs in the swamps. That's what I thought of. I'm sure you see other things. And I'm very excited because I'm going to make these into another work now. My father, who's a concreter, also really liked them, which is actually why I started working with concrete a little bit. When I was young and naughty, I would have to go to work with him when I got suspended from school. So I've sort of been around concrete for a long time. But he really liked these, and he said they'll polish up really nice, so I'm looking forward to making something else with them. Another really nice thing that happened was after those 2 days of measuring up and then taking the cores out and getting really, really sunburnt, it rained, and you know, the water, all of those holes were able to fill up and prepare the space for the planting, which I thought was a nice sign, maybe from the Ngunnawal ancestors. So we got this poa grass here, and you know, it's just really wonderful to meet people who believe in artists' ideas, and I think that that's something that's come through the previous presentations as well. And so I'm very grateful to Neil for being able to imagine it as well, and his partner Karina, who came down. Actually, we did this all together. It would have taken me hours, but they came down and we planted it. I think it took about 2 hours, and I thought Karina looked way too glamorous, but she assured me that she gardens like this all the time. So yeah, it's wonderful. Let's keep going because it's just fun. Yeah, that's great. And so that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of the scale. And it's interesting now, I've been staying in the chapel in the car park on the other side, and I've stayed there before, and the idea was quite, the word Walangalla and swamp country is, I felt was really appropriate. I've stayed there quite a few times, and I feel very strongly about that area being swamp country. And certainly when it's been raining over the last few weeks, it fills up and it looks like it's going to flood, and then it drains out. Neil also got organised for a drone to capture it, which is wonderful to see because you can't really see. I didn't really know if I'd done it like the drawing, and you can see that it does say Walangalla. And I'll leave you with this video. Oh, yeah, there it is, of the drone shot. Just not sure what's going on. It's loading. Okay. Maybe I'll Oh, I have to talk to Neil. I haven't yet. We have. It's temporary, right? The Contour 556 is a temporary, but the guys in Brodberger, they really liked it, and actually all the people have. It's really nice when you do something like this, and they were kind of shocked that we'd have to take it out and fill it in, and he said, I think you need to declare it as a Aboriginal site, a sacred Aboriginal site, so we can keep it here. So yeah, maybe we can organise that. I think this shot isn't going to work. Maybe the video is too large, but anyway, you can see from the sky that the word spelt out. Thank you for having me.
So it's really good to see an artist absolutely getting back to work. Thank you very much, Megan. So we're actually going to shift to the two speakers in session 2. If anyone needs to have a quick break, they might just duck out and come back. But if the speaker's on the stage, if you want to leave the stage, just take it safely down the stairs. And I'd like to welcome up to the stage Alex Weiser and Michael. Michael is Professor of Architecture at the University of Canberra. His conversation is really looking at architectural pavilions and essentially how they've become such a major element of what we're imagining really as crossing these borders between sculptural practice and the built environment, that the trend towards an architectural pavilion that is both a space for gathering and connection as well as an entity in itself. And there's 2 particular pavilions that have recently been commissioned in Melbourne that he'll be discussing. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Virginia. And thanks, Neil. I don't actually recall accepting the invitation. I just found myself on the program. So, Neil is more than persuasive. But seriously, thank you, Neil and Karina and everyone who's been involved in Contour 556, all the sponsors and the many individuals, and to the Playhouse. And Virginia, thank you for chairing. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and celebrate the ongoing contributions they make to our collective efforts. The temporary architecture pavilion, sheltering ideas and devices. In the following, I'll make some quick observations on the question of the architecture pavilion and the topic of public art. And I'll do this using 2 dialectical pairs, 2 polarities, not to say dualities or oppositions. And as Virginia said, I'll talk about 2 recent commissions in Australia. And I'll try to unpack the subtitle if there's time at the end. So the 2 pavilions. On your left, Glenn Murcutt's M Pavilion, commissioned by Naomi Milgram Foundation 2019, installed in Queen Victoria Gardens, Melbourne. And on your right, in absence, Johanni Skars and Edition Office, National Gallery Victoria, Architecture Commission 2019, installed in the National Gallery Victoria Grollo Equiset Garden. I should note that I have not had the chance to visit either project and that the marvelous photographs are not mine, alas, but are due on the one hand to John Gollings in the case of Murcutt's M Pavilion and Ben Husking in the instance of the Scarce Edition Office NGV Commission Pavilion on the other. 2 polarities. Autonomy versus contingency on the one hand, coherence versus ambiguity on the other. As with the images, the words have been borrowed. The terms have been adopted from a statement published in Henry Cobb's 2018 Words and Works. Now, what might these dialectical pairs mean in this context, or in this setting we find ourselves in relation to Contour 556 and the question of public art? To further frame the interpretation, or one interpretation, by autonomy versus contingency, I am asking, quote, in what way and by what means should a built work, while affirming its self-determined autonomy, manifest or express also its contingency with respect to the externalities that surround it? And in this context, those externalities, in the case of the public domain, also refer to and accompany its commissioning and its coming into being. By the second term, coherence versus ambiguity, I'm asking in what way and by what means should a built work, while affirming its coherence of purpose, manifest also its vulnerability to underlying ambiguity, paradox, and contrariety. So returning to the two pavilions, we might ask, does one fall more on the side of the autonomous and the other on that of the contingent? Can one claim to be conceived and realized in a manner that might lead us to think of it as clear and coherent, and the other more on the side of ambiguity, paradox, and what Cobb calls contrariety? And what might such considerations tell us about this evening on the occasion of Symposium on the topic of public art? What might they tell us about the temporary pavilion's role in all of that today? In order to unpack these questions, I'll walk us through a number of analytical slides that focus on 4 or 5 aspects in each of the projects. First aspect, that of approach. The M Pavilion is, it seems, clearly about many, a place for sheltering and expression with rows of seats awaiting public debate. The NGV Pavilion may seem to resist interpretation as public. Isn't it all about the private? The NGV Pavilion might be perceived as mute as opposed to vocal, which is certainly emphatic, at least in one view, in the M Pavilion. And in favor of the singular, its purpose, that of the NGV, its role might appear to be ambiguous. Does it ever invite entry? The M Pavilion triggers, it appears, oblique diagonal views and is out emphatically about being expansive. The NGV, with its centralized axial views, by contrast, seems equally coherent in its relation to the gallery building, axially aligned, the one on your left more emphatically horizontal, the other emphatically vertical. When within it, can we speak of being enclosed in the case of the NGV Pavilion? And what appears to be a simple cylinder reveals in this view to the sky to be ambiguous, complex, and perhaps not strictly as it seems. And looking up at the frame to cladding to structure details of the M Pavilion in the lower part of the screen, it appears to verge not on the machine, but on the organic, a skin and bone system, or to take the architect at his word, a metaphor for an airplane wing, a sentiment long lost. And so things may not be as simple as they first appeared. And if we now move to materials, the one is clearly an aggregate of multiple elements assembled, and the other clearly carved and singular. And to turn to the last aspect, one can ask, is there an inside in Murcutt's M Pavilion providing shelter in a clinical way versus the visceral memory machine of the NGV Pavilion, the architects and artists team talking about the memory of fires triggered by the scent of ash? The one again emphatically horizontal, the other vertical. The one for many people, the other perhaps ideally for one, a solitary visitor, if you can see the seat in the slide. The one apparently vocal, as earlier evoked, the other mute, closed, or so it appears, especially in this view from the outside. And so we return to the opening provocation, the conceit of two polarities, two dialectical pairs, as a lens to begin to interpret how these two temporary pavilions might operate as public works, and a survey of a very limited number of characteristic ideas and composition devices. And if we look more closely and think back, one starts to see the instability in the designations. While Murcutt's M Pavilion at first blush seems perfectly autonomous, it's also perfectly contingent in its orientation, its setting, its purpose, and its commissioning. It's an aggregate of many parts. And the scarce in addition pavilion at the NGV proves that while its scale and shape triggers a multivalence, a multiplicity of readings. It has a coherence and clarity that place it on the side of the autonomous. And the M Pavilion's apparently rational coherence is destabilized, emphatic in light of the architect's confession that the built form is a metaphor for the architect's memory of an experience in the Mexican desert some 34 years ago while seeking shelter. And the in absence pavilion at the NGV is clearly more on the side of ambiguity. Is it a whole shape which has been sliced? Is the ovoid expanding in a centrifugal movement, pushing what appear to be two elements apart that will over time reveal an inside, or rather is it under the centripetal force of a work which is starting to close just before we arrive? So with all these paradoxes at work and in its rigorous use of limited materials applied consistency, we must acknowledge, in the case of the NGV, the coherence of the whole. So we're left with the proposition, as opposed to a contrast of both pavilions being equally autonomous and contingent in purpose, place, and occasion, and in material realization. And both pavilions are both internally coherent to their respective place in accompanying narrative, and wonderfully ambiguous, paradoxical, and positively contrarian. And thus there is in the multivalent qualities something that might in fact be deemed to operate as works of public art in ways that this festival and many of the projects we saw earlier in the symposium have conjectured that public art always does, being multiple. Thank you.
I mean, it's almost interesting seeing the interior shots of Stan's work in Civic Square, how much of almost like a pavilion like it was. But I guess this evolution from that point of just how detailed and how evolved these kind of projects have become with architectural practices and the kind of money, I guess, that's involved in them.
And the difference of response.
Yeah.
Really fascinating.
Yeah. Interesting. So our final speaker this evening is Alex Weiser. And Alex, we haven't actually had a chance to meet yet, but hello. Thank you very much for coming. Alex is the director of Cementa Festival. So I guess we're finishing from the perspective of someone who probably is not that familiar with Canberra, but is very familiar with presenting public art in unexpected places. And Cementa probably has a lot of parallels. And at a time when we're all, I guess, reimagining how a lot of the arts are going to be functioning, the kinds of risk factors, the kinds of, but also the kinds of possibilities that are there, I think Cementa offers some really interesting insights for us to hear in Canberra about how we might look to continue to work in this temporal public art mode. So thank you very much for coming, Alex.
Oh, thank you. So just so you know, my PowerPoint style is I put up a whole bunch of pretty pictures that play in the background. I'm not going to speak to them. I don't have that level of sophistication. But they are of the festival, so they do relate to what I'm going to be trying to say. Now, is this playing automatically? Do you know?
Possibly could.
Which one's this one here? Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, cool. I did actually want to just start out by saying how valuable this was to me. A lot of that history I did not know and I was not aware of, but it is a history that I am aware of. Like it's something I know that the work that I do, it sits on strata of cultural activity that's all basically there, even if I don't happen to be personally aware of it. I do speak to that a little bit here, so that was very helpful. And I actually thought your presentation, there's a lot of resonances that I'm picking up as well in terms of those dichotomies you were playing with. There are dichotomies that I play with also, maybe not by the same names. So for those who don't know, Cementa is a biennial 4-day, 4-night, 40-artist contemporary art festival. Yeah, would you mind? That would be great, thank you. Art festival in the post-industrial town of Candos in rural New South Wales. A generation ago, the name Candos was synonymous with cement, having housed what was for a long time the largest cement works in the Southern Hemisphere, most famously known for having produced the material that built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and much of Sydney for that matter. And as I was writing this, I realized it probably supplied a lot of the cement that built Canberra as well, the public spaces. But then, you know, with Megan's work, I was just like, oh, wow, that's pretty interesting, actually. Maybe she could do a work at Candos and return the cement to the town. Though that cement did look pretty new, so it might not be from my neck of the woods. So the festival was established in 2013 by myself, my partner Georgina Pollard, and arts writer and academic Anne Finnegan, in response to the closing of the cement works in 2012. I was surprised by the enthusiasm that the first festival inspired. It was hardly an original idea, and in fact, its inception was almost formulaic. A 20th century industry closes down, leaving a small town in a state of uncertainty about its future, and art springs up like microbial decomposers that quickly set about breaking down the body of the past in preparation for a promised, though unknown, future. Cementa is so unoriginal that it takes its name from another festival. So why then did it generate such enthusiasm? I would suggest that its fascination was a product of the fact that the festival and Candos represented an outside. The outside of an art world that is enclosed by white walls and track lighting, not to mention the hard, high strata of its social and political structures, its rarefied etiquette of display, and the relatively foregone conclusions that an exhibition within these terms will inevitably produce. Candos is the industrial other to high art, and like any such site since the decline of 20th century industry, for artists, it is a site of high fascination. It would be a mistake to pause here at this statement, as though what we are talking about are the social relations between industrial and art objects. The relative longevity of the festival is predicated upon another, more unexpected encounter. This is the encounter between the people of Candos and the people of the art world, or if you like, the collision of two very different cultures. The nature of this collision became evident to us at the very inception of the festival, and in a large part, it has set the tone for both Cementa and its relationship with the town. We were very aware that we were throwing a party in someone else's home, and were concerned to make sure that they were somehow invited. Our solution was to ask the festival artists to complete a residency in Candos and make their work relate to the social, economic, cultural, or environmental context of the town. The idea behind this strategy was that even if the language of contemporary art might be alien to the local community, the subject matter would be familiar, and frankly, something they would have a certain authority over. This principle has over the years solidified into a cornerstone of the festival and determined much of the trajectory of its development, as well as the development of both my own life and arts practice. As to how successful it has been, the answer is and will always be, well, we'll see. For that first festival, at least, it was not a silver bullet, and Cementa's birth could indeed be considered a collision. There was one particular incident in which an artist overstepped a boundary in the preparation of their work, trespassing onto the home of a recently deceased resident. The town reacted, and the incident served as a lightning rod for the apprehensions of the community, with a very strong response on social media. While we eventually negotiated an apology and a gesture of reparation that calmed the situation down enough for us to proceed with the festival, the incident had revealed the tension everyone was already feeling. What we were doing had consequences, and there was a sense, especially amongst the artists, that what we were doing was taking a risk under circumstances that were completely unpredictable. Alongside the natural sense of terror that this produced, there was also exhilaration, and a sense that what we were doing had a meaning that could not be made within the art world. This is what I consider to be the seductive quality of the outside, that working in public spaces means involving the actual world around you in a dialogue that cannot be constrained to the intention of the artist, nor isolated from elements that might be hostile or irrelevant to it. Far from discouraging the artist, this terrifying prospect can be enervating, and it can focus the artistic attention to a point as fine as that which forms when your very survival is on the line. We have had 3 festivals since the first, but never have we reproduced the same level of attention to the local audience as that achieved at that first festival. Through their work, the artists demonstrated a keen consideration of what the people of Candos might be thinking of them, a kind of self-consciousness that we usually only spare for the decision makers of the art world. And it was really quite fascinating because, you know, the artists were coming up and they were very, very aware of the fact that they were going to be, you know, they were going to be facing a very difficult, skeptical audience, and we're responsive to that. So a lot of the works in that first festival actually addressed that. And my favorite amongst them was an artist named Daniel Kocha, who's since passed. He made a work called The Cultural Refinement Industry, which was a large machine with a conveyor belt on it. And he was meant to sit inside of it, and the conveyor belt would run, and locals were invited to put their cultural objects onto the conveyor belt, which would convey them into the machine. He was in there with a hammer. He would smash them up, and they would come out refined. And basically making an artwork, or, you know, that I thought was a pretty honest reflection of a lot of the of those fears and apprehensions that were circulating around the town. A lot of the works were also, they were very humorous and self-deprecating as well. You know, artists attempting to basically play down any of the sense of intimidation that would be coming in terms of this, you know, what is considered a high art, or, you know, a culture. I know this was one of the big fears in the town, was that people just thought we were coming out to look down our noses at them. So this experience made me realize how valuable this was to both art and to artists, that we submit ourselves to the scrutiny and the opinion, no matter how hostile, no matter how skeptical, of those who live and experience life in culturally different modes. After that first festival, Georgie and I, we moved into Candos, we bought a house and integrated our lives into the community. I've since run for local council, and I'm the secretary of the Chamber of Commerce. We definitely have a much stronger support in the community, but there will always be those who are hostile or skeptical. Local community involvement is always an ongoing challenge. But I don't think the aim of what we are doing is to meld the two cultures or communities until there is no contradiction between them. It's not to come up with a fully resolved artwork that can sit there perfectly without any internal contradictions. I think the opportunity of Cementa is to allow these two communities to negotiate their difference from one another without seeking to eliminate it. The point is not to resolve their collision, but to mediate it. I think this is what is still exciting about the enterprise of Cementa, that it is not an accomplished fact, but still a trial and an experiment, a question, and the slow, arduous working out of its answer. Thank you very much.
I read a little bit online about the slight controversy about this particular work, and which you might want to just...
Yeah, so we actually had the first festival, which was very difficult. The next two were much calmer, and the last festival, that tension showed up again, and it was again it was for me, anyways. It was the second best festival. And part of it was because we had closed down the swimming pool to put a major work into it, which was a really wonderful work put on by PYT Fairfield, and it was all around swimming pool culture. It was young performers from the area were brought in to make the work. We gave performances away to the high school. The local community was invited to participate. But, you know, again, we didn't realize that it would have such a strong response to close the pool down. And it happened to fall on the first hot day of the year, week of the year. So they couldn't take their kids to school. We did rejig it so that we were just going to close the swimming pool completely, and we just reduced it down to the hours that we were going to be there. But it had gotten out, and again, it's about that tension that exists at all times. It exists through the times. Most people leave town for the festival. We all know this is what happens when big festivals hit town. The people that don't like it, they leave, they go away. And we have another festival, a burnout festival in Candos. And, the half that stay for Samantha, they leave town during that one. So, again, it's about these two cultures that are, that they're two cultures that don't ever meet. Like, this is one of the things that I find really fascinating. Like, I've never had such a sense of class, of what class it is in Australia since I've moved to Candos. But I'm aware of it at all times now. Like, it's something that's kind of risen up, that there are these two different worlds. And they are worlds that should be talking to each other more. We should be better aware of one another, and we're not. And we, and you see what that division is producing.
Well, I hope the ambition of Contour is to blow those things here, and obviously in Candos you're doing that there. Yeah. So I'd just like to invite Neil Hobbs to just say a few closing remarks. Many thanks have already been given to Neil. I'd certainly like to say it from the behalf of Canberra Museum and Gallery team that we're really thrilled to have been a partner with you for this symposium and to present both Ian Maher's work and Richard Lewis' work here. So with us. So yeah, thank you, Neil.
Yep. Thanks, Virginia, and thanks to the panel. It's been really. I've loved hearing that, Alex. I mean, I met Alex last. I've been to two cementers very briefly, just for day trips, and I bumped into him at one of the exhibits in last November when all the fires were burning around. That was the start of that Gospers Mountain fire, and it was just coming over the hill and so on. I thought, oh, will I actually get there before, will they close it down? Anyway, but it's all, look, working with CMAG's been fantastic. It's been really great working with Virginia. It's been really great having another Contour, having all the artists involved, having a whole lot of new artists coming down here, having more sponsors, having more support from the wider Canberra community and beyond. We're really well funded by ACT government through City Renewal, through Arts ACT, through Events ACT. Australia Council is always a bit of hit and miss, but we were lucky. We got some funding from them this time. Really good support through crowdfunding too before Christmas, so thank you all who contributed to that. And of course, a new sponsor, the Alistair Swain Foundation, of which Michael's a board member, and that was really interesting to see Michael's presentation too about that, because again, the pavilion, it's a bit of a they're popular. People like to, foundations like to sponsor them. I don't know what they get out of them. That's probably the next question, is to say, okay, what on earth would the what's the Milgram Foundation getting out of doing that sort of stuff? Just playing at architecture, or just like, I don't know. It's an interesting sort of thing to see what they're about. But thanks all of you for coming. We've got one announcement. Canberra Dance Theatre's performance is going to be at 5:30 tomorrow at Commonwealth Place because of the weather on Saturday. So we're going to bring it forward to 5:30 on tomorrow evening, Friday evening. Then, of course, at 8 o'clock, we're at 8 Petrie Plaza with the River Diaries again, indoors, so we'll be fine for the weather there. We've got a couple more things happening on the Saturday. Kerry Polinus' drawing performance is going to be awkward. We'll have to have a discussion about how we manage that with 25 mils of rain and needing dry concrete to draw in chalk, but we'll see what happens. So watch social, keep looking at social media. Anyway, thank you all, and thank you.
Thank you very much.